So, with that rather lengthy preamble, and I apologize for that, I'd like to introduce our speakers here. On my left, Christian Ehler, who is a member of the European Parliament from Germany, and has been a rapporteur, which in Parliament speak means he's been very important for the drafting of the legislation, guiding it, one of the people guiding it through the process of Horizon 2020. On my right is Maria de Graça Carvalho, member of the European Parliament from Portugal, who is also a rapporteur for Horizon 2020. They've divided the legislation up into pieces and have dealt with them that way. And on her right is James Ellis, a member of the European Parliament from the UK, who is the longest-serving member of the Budget Committee. And as much of Horizon 2020 actually ends up being about money, has a somewhat interesting perspective on these things. So with that preamble, could I just ask you very briefly, Graça, you said you were up till 3 o'clock in the morning the other night doing working on the deal. I'm sure you were involved deeply in the midst of it also. What have you done? Are we about done? Is the legislation nearly cooked?
I hope yes. So good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. Yesterday we had a negotiation on the amending budget of 2013 and the annual budget of 2014. That for us is important piece to vote the big budget for 2014-2020. For us was a package, and we need to find an agreement into amendment budget 2013 and 14. And we did, very late, but we did. So we have, I think, the conditions to vote the big budget is called MFF, multi-annual financial framework. That is the European budget for 2014-2020. Next week, we have the plenary in Strasbourg, and we need to vote that budget in order to vote the different programs, Horizon 2020, the regional funds, the agriculture, everything is in the same condition. So we have vote Horizon 2020 in the committee. We had a fantastic result. We had the support of all the political groups, all the countries, and overwhelming support. But now we need to vote in plenary, and we cannot vote without the budget. So we are almost there. Still at this time there is meetings going on to see if the conditions are all there to vote the MFF, the budget. I hope they are. The big ones are, so small details I hope that we can solve, and we will vote in the beginning of next week the budget so that we can vote Horizon 2020 on Wednesday, on Thursday. That Commission can start launching the calls, and everyone can start work 1st of January in the new program.
Open the champagne, huh?
Of the budget, I think we won't have the money for champagne, but yes, we are still in the phase a little bit of horse trading. It's not so much the overall MFF, it's what we call the flexibilities or the technicalities of the program. But since everyone wants to start with the program in 2014, I think there's a certain tendency that the rapporteurs will advise the President to present the report in the plenary next week. But these technicalities are back and forth $1 billion or so. So
what kind of issues are still in the technicalities?
I think the result of the overall budget negotiation had been substantial cuts, and the offer in favor, to some extent, if you would call it an offer in favor, was that we need more flexibilities in the instruments, so that within the budget, you could switch money from one challenge to the other. That there's certain reserve and money allocated for specific projects, and in practical terms, we got a little bit more money for the budget also. So, but that's really important because I think if we want to have an ambitious program, if we want to really go in the direction of innovation, we need flexibility. If this is just a bottom-down, very static inflexible budget, we can't react, and we want. We did take the budget cuts, but we want the needed flexibility for the Commission in order to react on changing situations, to switch budgets between budget lines and something like that. That sounds boring, but in real terms it's very important in terms of flexibility.
But will that happen, do you think, then? Will that in fact happen? That there will be, these technicalities will be sorted? You think so?
Can I?
Yeah.
There is one condition not related with Horizon 2020 that is more difficult. That is the macro conditionality of the
macro conditionality
of the funds for cohesion and regional funds.
Yeah.
That is putting some problems. It means that countries that are with deficit or excessive debt cannot have some penalties getting access to regional funds. And that is dividing the Parliament, but is not related to Horizon 2020. But we hope to have an agreement that we can vote the MFF. And that is in certain way embedded in the MFF also.
James, what is your overall impression of the budget?
Well, I think it's not been undisclosed secret that we're living in tough times, and you're never going to get large sums extra coming into this kind of area, even if one would like it to. But we would like to be sure that what we have is going to be spent well. And so I think the work my colleagues have been doing, making sure priorities are there from sort of Parliament's point of view, that is work which is now, as they say, almost complete. But I remember when addressing your wonderful organisation a few months back that Parliament wasn't going to be a rollover, as I think that has been shown. We rejected the first deal that the European Council gave in March, and one of the main elements was that we'd have a mid-term review inserted in there, because if we're living in tough times now, it may be, and hopefully things will look a bit better in 2-3 years' time, so that then one would be able to provide some kind of input into urgent areas like innovation. So I would still hope that now we have a mid-term review within the final package, that this will not be neglected, as the other mid-term reviews have been in the last 2 financial frameworks, and that something will come out of it, because if there's anything that's really been lost in this negotiation, it's the funding on connecting facility and on digital infrastructure, where it has been cut back by 90% of the proposals which were made by the European Commission. And yet you have a European Council last month on digital markets saying we've got to do something about it. Well, it would actually be very nice that they would actually think about policy framework first and then the budget afterwards, rather than hacking back the budget and then saying, oh, sorry, we forgot about that. Well, we'll be plundering the structural funds to get ICT money. I'm not sure that's going to happen. Pigs could start flying before that will really happen.
Well, that's an interesting point. But you think that this will be done next week?
Yeah.
Can we bet on it?
Yes.
For those of you who aren't into the details of this matter, I mean, what's at stake here ultimately is the funding of a significant chunk of the funding for many of the most important universities in Europe, as well as companies and SMEs, and overall it's 70 billion euros, right?
No, but it's the agriculture, is everything.
James.
I think that we should recognise that, I mean, this is the best integrated approach that has happened. So instead of having, I think, FP8, you're going to have Horizon 2020 with a number of different things which are going to be properly thought through with a number of different themes. I'm just concerned that on areas like mobile and broadband, we're still going to be way behind our competitors in Asia and elsewhere, and we haven't put enough funds where they should be placed.
Thank you. Let's drop away from the politics of it for just a moment, if that's possible, and talk about the substance. So, all of these words that have been shed on Horizon 2020 and research and innovation policy over these many years. Is there anything good in the resulting legislation? I mean, can you tell me one thing that you think that you're happy about in Horizon 2020? Yeah, James.
Yeah, I mean, I had a lot of cases, particularly one which was very excoriating, if that can be translated into other languages, but of a small business which had applied for funding, and then they found that they'd got something which was slightly wrong, and then with the controls done, they had to then hand back the money, and they bankrupted the company. And this was a matter that the procedures were not simplified sufficiently. So I think that the campaign that we have run, and Maria particularly, and others, to make sure that this is going to be easier to be able for small and medium-sized companies to benefit from this thing, I would think that is a major plus. And let's hope that the provisions which have come in, I think, are often campaigning from the cases which we've had, which, as I said, were pretty horrifying when you saw how rigorous some of these cases were dealt with. One hopes that now in the Horizon 2020 that this won't have been an impediment for a number of thousands of companies across Europe to now not to be part of these particular provisions.
I think if I remember the numbers correctly, the Commission is estimating that somewhere between 200,000 and 1.5 million small companies, depending on how the details work out. Yeah, very precise, but could end up being beneficiaries of this. Yes, it's a huge fourchette, but still, that's a lot of companies. But are you confident that the implementation will be, in fact? Well, first James.
Well, no, I just say the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and I think it for colleagues who are following this in the specific committees to make sure now the provisions, as they say in the agreements, that now these are going to be much simplified procedures, that we don't find a number of companies being deterred or being pushed into other places across the globe because they find the European environment too bureaucratic or too inward-looking.
Christian, what is the one thing that you're happy about, most happy about anyway?
I think I would like to take up the SME case. In the end, it's about money. And I think for the first time, we haven't allocated a specific budget for small and medium-sized companies, and that's important. And in terms of the rules, it fits to small and medium-sized companies. So we had a lot of Sunday speeches. We had votes on the percentage and whatever. But we never succeeded because to some extent we were driving small and medium-sized companies in big consortia, and they wouldn't make it. It would have led to frustration and so. And I think the overall idea of the Parliament was that we wanted to have a dedicated budget with dedicated rules for innovative small and medium-sized companies. And I think that is a big achievement. And the other thing, if I may add, is although this is a pilot aspect, but I think we took the ambition of the Commission in terms of innovation serious when we put a new instrument in the proposal, and this is the fast track to innovation. That changes the game.
Remind us what that is.
The program is pretty much bottom down, so you would have calls year by year along the challenges and so on. And I think for the first time we see in 2015, 2016, a full-scale pilot project pretty much saying, if you have a project, if it's innovative, it's limited in scope, it's limited in terms of participants, but you come to the Commission and you ask and you get an answer within 6 months whether you're funded or not. And this is a game changer from our point of view because that is really boosting innovation because you're not waiting for something. It's not bottom down. It's not top down. It's bottom up. So if you build a small consortia, you would get an answer within 6 months. And I think that could change a lot, not just regarding the range of the project or proposal now in the program.
I think just for comparison, I think under FP7 the average time to grant was 365 weeks or no days. Oh gee.
Yeah, but you have to be careful because we shouldn't follow our own myths. Yes, we wanted to be the proposal faster, but we are mixing up huge projects where the consortia phase takes months or years. If you have big JETIs, PPPs, huge collaborative projects, I think it's a myth to think that you could do that in 6 months. So what we wanted to achieve is that if it's smaller, if it's faster, it's more innovative, it's more driven by industry, then it should be faster. So it's not that this overall approach that we reduced the time to grant to 6 months in terms of the fast track and to 8 months for the overall program is pretending that everything will work in 8 months. That's pretentious, and I think that doesn't reflect the realities of complex consortia which are running for years. But if we want to go in the direction of innovation, it has to be faster. And I think that the level of ambition which is there and shared by the three institutions would bring us on a level which makes us, we are in a competitive surrounding. And in Asia and in the United States, the innovation process and the allocation of money is simply faster.
Okay. So what are you happy about, if anything?
I'm happy about a lot of things. There are very beautiful things in Horizon 2020, the whole cycle of innovation, the involvement of SMEs, the involvement of young researchers, return grant, open to the rest of the world. But if I have to choose one, I would choose simplification, like Alice. It was simplification. It was my first report that I did the report on simplification on the rules. I have indicated 70 measures where Commission should simplify. I keep tracing. I have a table that I fill in what they are doing in the Commission. For the time being, I would say that 95% are there. But with simplification, you need to follow, because bureaucracy grows spontaneously. It's like entropy. If you don't do anything, it grows always. It never diminishes, especially if you have an organization, a public organization. The tendency is for entropy and bureaucracy to grow. So someone has to keep controlling the simplification process, because it's the natural tendency to get more complex. But for the time being, it's much simplified, and this is very good for the SMEs, for the newcomers, because framework program, all of them, 7 framework program, you could see that was for the usual ones, and now Horizon 2020, because it's simpler, because there's the widening of participation, is open to new participants, to small units, to younger innovators. So it's very important, and the simplification is an important part of being open to newcomers.
Okay. Well, okay, then let's flip the question the other way. What don't you like in the legislation?
The budget.
The budget.
Yeah.
Yes, the
And
budget.
this is-
What do you mean?
in practical terms, we messed it up. Europe was, and this was a joint approach of all the head of states, was claiming that they would spend 3% of the GDP in 2020 for R&D. And in practical terms, we're doing 2%. And if you see the ratio between the public and the private sector, it's sometimes even worse. So it's not just us messing it up in many countries, it's also the private sector not investing sufficiently in R&D. And we have to state that clearly. I think there is an embedded good news, because for the first time, although that sounds very technical, we created that bridge between the structural funds and R&D. So we are going to spend an amount of money, a proportion of money out of the structural funds, not for another street or whatever infrastructure project, weird infrastructure project. We are going to allocate that for R&D. So that will be a trigger, I think, in terms of R&D. But in practical terms, we would have needed at least 100 million to somehow come closer to the 3%.
100 billion. Billion, you meant. 100 billion euros.
We have 7.
Yes.
Yeah, we have 79, actually.
Okay, but that would have been, a monumental increase over the 55 billion of the last framework program.
But the program is very ambitious.
I think we don't have to paint it in black and white. But given the level of ambition formulated by the Council And this is not just a council or political decision. It's a question whether we can be on an eye-to-eye level with the United States, with our partners in Asia, and we stick to the 2% more or less through that budget. And that has to be a clear-cut message in a way that the question was not whether we would expand the budget, but the question had been within the budget, where are the priorities? And we are going to allocate 40% of the European budget to agriculture. The rest goes to the infrastructure, and then there are these tiny 79 billion euros left for innovation. And I think innovation will create jobs and growth in Europe, and not so much the agriculture sector, which is 1.6% of the European GDP. And whether we spend all the structural funds in a very smart way, it's hard to tell, but whether that boosted growth in Europe, it's quite questionable. So in a way, although we think we achieved a lot in terms of flexibility, this bridge to the structural funds, though, so that's not no longer limited to specific infrastructure issues, I think it was quite smart. But in the end, we decided to spend in 2020 3% of the GDP, and we won't do. We will spend 2%, and compared to the United States and compared to our Asian partners, it's 1% less.
James, you mentioned the midterm review, a review along the way. Could this number actually move significantly?
If the UK government agrees.
Please turn
If
it
the
on.
UK government agrees.
We're not the only ones who are looking for a limited budget. As you know, we had a number of other states like Germany and Holland and others alongside the European decision. The Council was, after all, it has to be.
Garcia is giving a running commentary as you speak.
It's taken by the whole of the European Council. But I think that take it a little bit more seriously rather than just isolate one member state. I think it will depend much on the campaigns which open out into European elections next year, as to whether lead candidates who will be appointed by the political parties actually take this as a major priority in saying, look, we are falling behind. We think that what is now shaped up, hopefully it becomes a really well-run program, and that we think that investments should, as the economies grow, be able to be allocated into these particular areas. So you take example of the European Council, which I said last month on the digital market. It's extremely important that one should be able to do things which provide us with a proper infrastructure that we can be competitive with Asian counterparts. And I think about the implementation of 4G in Europe, and it's a complete disaster if you're looking at having a real fast implementation of what is a modern technology. I would have thought we're not moving fast enough. So if we have the kind of political environment where we don't criticize, but where we actually think, how is Europe going to be better off? How are we going to be really competitive in the global system? How are we going to be competitive with our existing social models when we know that we're spending too much money maybe in some areas which other countries aren't? This is the kind of debate which I think we should be having as we move into elections next year, and hopefully then you'll find that when the Commission is with the hearings by this time next year, that you'll actually have somewhere at the top of the agenda, yes, for the midterm review, we would like there to be some changes, and it'll have to be for the Commission to come up, or the new Commission to come up for that. And that's the way the European Union works. It's done by discussion, debate, and then conclusion of what priorities should be. And I would like to see this as a priority into the next Commission and next mandate of the European Parliament, so we don't just languish behind saying, oh, sorry guys, we can't do this, we're left behind. I think that there will be opportunities, and I think that should the economy grow as we would like it to, and other countries will be growing as fast as Britain, it'd be nice to see that, then we would be able then to make some real progress.
James, before I leave you, is there anything then in particular that you really don't like about Horizon 2020, or have you already hinted at it?
That in terms of something which, in the current circumstances where we have a base rate of 0.5%, as I don't fail to say back in my own country, which has been there for 4 or 5 years, it's likely to be there for another, these are not normal conditions. These are very fragile economic conditions where we're living in. The fact that you've got a system as the European Union is imperfect, but it comes up with a package which is as good as it could have done in the circumstances, in my belief, and that what we must do is build on that and make sure that where we see priorities coming, where Europe is lagging behind and we would like to see investments made, then the case has to be made to the authorities which have the money to make sure it's at the top of the list.
Okay. Lasse, what don't you like?
I don't like the budget, like my previous colleagues, because this program is a very ambitious program. When you add innovation, you are adding a lot of ambitions, because if you have the whole cycle of innovation in areas like transport or energy, it means that you are going from the more fundamental research, technological development, full-scale demonstration, and early entries to the market. And full-scale demonstration on CCS, on carbon capture and storage, in the offshore wind, in transport, in aeronautics are huge projects, huge amount of money. If you really mean innovation in the full way of innovation. And this is the reason that we need to make the bridge with the regional funds. It's a demonstration will be made in a region that is entitled to regional funds, that they should contribute to the demonstration plant, mainly for the full-scale demonstration.
But so then the result of the legislation, is this, 7 years from now, do you really think that you'll be able to look back and say that it made a difference in the competitiveness, the innovation, entrepreneurship, and all those other breakthroughs in science?
I always say to fund, innovation is a very complex, non-linear process. It's not enough to fund innovation to have innovation. You have to fund, mainly you have to have a very efficient and well-funded research system. You need to have an efficient and well-funded education, mainly higher education system, but you have framework conditions that need to be in place. Framework conditions like the macroeconomic conditions, competition, the intellectual property, immigration laws, everything has to be innovation friendly. The taxes need to be innovation friendly. I have the example of Portugal. We have done very well on research and the innovation indicators. Innovation in terms of things that could be funded. The fastest growing in Europe. That didn't have any effect on the economic conditions because the macroeconomic conditions were not there. There was not availability of funding from the banks. So there were reforms that you need. So you need to have a lot of structural reforms in the countries to have a friendly atmosphere, environment for business and innovation in order to have innovation. We cannot expect Horizon 2020 or member states funding programs of innovation to do the work. If you don't do the necessary reforms, in 7 years you will not find the jobs, the SMEs, and go against the brain drain. You need to do everything at the same time. You need to have funding, but you need to do the reforms that are necessary in Europe, mainly in some countries. Not some have done these reforms, but a lot of countries have not done these reforms.
Okay. Do you think it will have made a difference?
Yes, I think so. I think the level of ambition is amazing. I think the Parliament was closely following a lot of positions from the Commission. I don't want just to highlight what we added as a Parliament. I think that for the first time there's a shift, a mind change in the Commission towards innovation. There's a certain limit to that. Innovation is a very expensive piece. So we were always asking us to what extent there would be, as I said, the needed budget. But in practical terms, it will be faster. It will be more appealing for people who want to get something on the market. It will be more appealing for entrepreneurs. And I think that is a substantial change. If you see the changes coming from FP5, FP6, FP7, I think this is really a mind changer. As Grasser rightly said, it has to have the real the important economic surrounding, the reforms needed in the member states, sometimes even the reforms in member states' scientific structure. We shouldn't forget about the transformation process which we are in some of the G17, so in the new member states. But I think given the level of ambition, you will see there will be a lot of outcome, and I'm really convinced that we didn't add a 29th research program. I think the aspect that the European Common Market is in the focus of the program. That's something completely new, and I think we will see a lot of positive things.
But why is that
out.
good? Why couldn't? You said that the EU should increase its overall spending to. You mentioned the 3% target, but why wouldn't it have been just fine if the German government, for instance, had just? It has been increasing its R&D spending. Why does it have to be at the EU level? Why not just let the member states raise the money?
I think it's not the institutional EU level. I think there is. I was the CEO of one of the biggest biotechnology centers in Germany. We were well funded. I think we have very good institutes. We are working on a world level, but still, we are no longer on our own. I would have had a single research project which we could do out of just national resources anymore. 90% of the projects are collaborative projects, and we need the European research area in order to be really on the top competitive level. And so there is no inner balance. We are saying, okay, leave away the European budget, and we do that on the national level. First of all, it doesn't happen in real terms, and secondly, this is done. Even relatively big member states like UK, like Germany, can't do it. A company like Rolls-Royce is no more a UK-based company. This is a company which is, yes, UK-based, but practically 70% of the research would be done in Germany. And even in Germany, it's done by a range of European researchers we have to attract to stay in Europe and not to go to Asia or to go to the United States. So the idea that you have a fallback option in terms of research, a national fallback option, doesn't reflect the reality.
Mm-hmm. But then to come back to the political issue a little more, you all have made reference to the respective roles of the Parliament and the Council and the Commission in this whole negotiation. James, if I could start with you. Has anything fundamentally changed in the relation among the three bodies when setting budget?
I don't think so. I think it, as Christian Ehler has nicely said, it's been an ongoing process, a building of what's already been. You're not inventing something totally new, but I think he's probably right that this is significantly moving to a different level, so that in the fact that you can get agreement between the arms of the budgetary authority and be able to put this show on the road. As I think I would conclude, this is not the only package in the MFF now being done. This is one of many packages which are being put together, and it's all being complicated by interlinking the annual budget process with the longer term, but that I think is now where we've got to. We'll get a vote on this next week. I think I'd be happy to buy you a bottle of champagne that'll actually happen. But whether you drink it or not is up to you, and that we should then be able to get the show on the road. I think that it's extremely important that as the economies begin to recover, that then the funds should be available and be available as fluidly as possible with the right kind of understandings between the Budget Authority and the European Commission, which I think is what's now happened.
What do you think? Is anything fundamentally changing?
First, I want to refer to the fact that research should be done at the highest level. Completely agree with my colleague Christian Ehler. That is a very important topic, even for the negotiations, to show to the member states that what they get from the framework program is not only the budget, is the access to cooperation and to more knowledge when they enter into a framework project at European level. So research is a competition and collaboration and should be done with the best where they are, in Europe or outside. If you want to advance faster, you need to link with the best that are working worldwide on that area. And it's interesting that the capacity building is local, research should be done at the global level, at least European level, and innovation is again more locally. So it's the fact that you can, because it's more the application and there's a more regional related. So you can, it's the reason that you can, in an easy way, to link with the regional funds and with the funds from the member states. What changed? All these negotiations were done in very difficult conditions. I understand the difficulties of member states on the budget with ministers of finances. They are under very strong stress, and they have to solve very difficult problems, and sometimes with a timetable that is until the end of the year. They are working on very difficult conditions, so there were extremely difficult negotiations. And what happened is that in the council we had the Friends of Agriculture, we had the Friends of the regional funds of the cohesion, Friends of Cohesion, and we have the Friends of Better Spending. So we were expecting that of the Friends of the Better Spending, they should be the Friends of Research and Innovation, but we didn't manage to convince them because the first priority was better spending. We understand why, but we need to convince
spending?
Better spending. So it means a bit less budget cuts, but we need to convince them that
sounds
they need to be friends of research and innovation because they gain a lot, and there are countries that gained a lot with FP7 and will continue to gain a lot with Horizon 2020, not only in terms of budget, but in terms of access to knowledge, access to markets, access to business. So it's one of the works that we need to do until the midterm review, is that the better spending are friends of the research and innovation.
Okay. Let's take a few questions at this point. I believe there's some questions from online, and then we'll take one in the room. Yes, go ahead. Marilyn Fiaschi, one of our directors. Please, what have you got?
We've got a question from Twitter. Will the Horizon 2020 program prioritize sustainability projects in research and innovation?
Will it prioritize sustainability projects? I see. All right. So, yes.
There is a lot of areas related with sustainability, and there is an overall agreement that the EU has to spend a certain percentage on everything that is related with sustainability and climate change. So we had to do this calculation to go through the whole set of priorities and see if we match. Is a international commitment from the climate change agreement, and that is a fact. So a higher percentage of the funds are related to clean energies, climate change, CO2, sustainable CO2 reduction, sustainable technologies, and that will be a fact.
Question over there, I saw. By the way, when you ask the question, you just push the little microphone button in the red dot, and when you're done, push it again to turn it off.
Herman Hauser of Cambridge, England. I was absolutely delighted to hear that conversation about innovation and stressing innovation, and I'm still puzzled, and Christian was so right, by the balance that we give to innovation versus agriculture. It seems, in any international concept, nonsensical to do that. But if we concentrate on innovation in particular, there's 2.7 billion, I believe, in the Horizon program set aside for financial support of SMEs and innovation. And the one thing that I think is really missing there is it looks at the moment as if all the 2.7 billion is going to debt rather than equity. Now, anybody who knows about how innovation is financed in Europe and indeed anywhere in the world is you cannot finance it by debt because nobody will give an early SME any debt. The only way you can finance innovation is equity. So at least 1 billion of that 2.7 billion should go into equity, and I'd be very interested to hear your reaction to that.
Parliament would go beyond. So technically seen, we take roughly 3 billion out of the program, and then we trigger it with the European Investment Fund up to 15 billion. So the financial instrument is quite substantial, and we didn't talk about that. That's almost 1/3 in relation of the overall budget, aside the given budget. Yes, we had a focus on that. It was the Parliament really driving these instruments. We were very much backing the Commission on that issue. There were a lot of questions coming from the Member States about that, and also from researchers. But we would like to see more emphasis on VC. The question is to what extent there are certain conditions to that. So whether we would focus on certain technologies, whether at least we would there would be a privilege, for example, for special interest funds, because VC money is not necessarily smart in Europe. We have more of a portfolio approach in many VC funds than we have a certain specialization. So I think there is some reason to have a focus on these instruments. We're in the very phase of creating these instruments. Now the contracts had been done between the European Commission and the European Investment Fund. But yes, I think it's a very it's an intervention at the right point, because we think we are losing a little bit focus in terms of the private equity issue, and I think that's of utmost importance from my point of view, because the leverage is so high.
Question? Yes. Please identify yourself.
Andrei Grubins, Research Executive Agency. Since the budget was reduced, I would kindly like to know what kind of provisions have been stipulated in terms of effectiveness and efficiency. FP7 doesn't have that much of effectiveness and efficiency. We are financing, there will be projects, very, very expensive projects financed, which could have been done with less of money, maybe from another part of Europe. Are there any provisions in Horizon 2020 to improve that?
I think the intention is there. If I may say so, with Robert Jan Switzer, is a very ambitious new general director. We tried to back his idea that he wants to change a pig into a racing horse. I think there are a lot of provision in terms of flexibility, externalization, and so on, so that we think that there are provisions. But then, in reality, we have to see what the Commission is coming up with, the proposals in practical terms. And so, yes, as far as it was possible in a legislative piece, I think we did take care. But then, legislation is a very abstract thing, and we have to see to what extent we see that the proposals are not just prestigious or just to get away money. We hope that this flexibility we were offering, and specifically this aspect we want to bring in, that we have a certain bottom-up approach and not so much the top-down approach, would lead in that direction. Because if people are interested, if you get a consortium together, you could be quite sure that there is an intention to do smart, quick, and fast calls. So in a way, I think we wanted to open up that by implementing this pilot project on the fast track to innovation.
Well, very briefly, if I could ask you, as a final comment, what would you advise anybody who's looking for money from Horizon 2020? Is there any advice that you would give them?
A former researcher and with good results in previous FPs, FP programs, I would advise networking, to do a lot of contacts with the best that you have in Europe in your area, and to be persistent, not to give up. Doesn't mean that you really is complex. You need to have partners. You need to have to be excellent in your work, but you need to keep persistent.
But I thought it was
and
supposed to be
networking.
simplified now. No.
Even simplified is still you need to be persistent. It's not easy.
I think it's a give and take. Yes, there was complexity related to European funding, but if you see the structure, for example, universities would have to apply for this kind of funding. You wouldn't see much of a smart portfolio strategy in many universities. They would jump on something. It would be driven by an individual, by a professor, by a certain branch or whatsoever. But you hardly see universities where there's a structured approach, pretty much saying within the next 5 years we want to achieve this and that. We need this and that means. We have a portfolio strategy which makes us not so dependable on whether we got this call or that call. So I think, although, yes, there is related complexity, but my grandmother always said there is always some effort to take to get other people's money. And so in a way, if you don't have a European strategy, an internationalization strategy, which is not just meant to get through the so-called bureaucratic jungle. It's a question whether you have a network of partners, you invest in that network of partners. If you start all over from zero, building up these international corporations, the level of investment and the risk that out of a failed portfolio strategy you get frustrated is there. So in a way, it's also an appeal not always to reflect to the complexities. It's a question whether you have a strategy. And then you will be relatively successful. So if you compare the effort, the RTOs, which are the main drivers of the European programs, are investing in that, compared to universities often complaining and then not willing just to invest in a single person caring continuously about European programs, then you wouldn't be able just to refer on the complexities on the European level. It's often a nice and decent pillar for people not having a smart strategy in that field.
Would you have any advice for applicants?
Well, just thinking so far as the past is concerned, the previous question, I mean, if you've got examples where you don't think money's been well spent because you have information, do pass it to the budget authority, that is me, and as a member of it, I would be delighted to follow up any areas where you think that money has not been efficiently well run or whatever, because I got the sense that you probably may have one or two ideas in that particular. If not, then that's a general kind of comment, because after all, one wants to be sure that we get value for money at all levels of activity and implementation. On the future, I think if we're thinking about networking, there was an excellent example of this last week, where I was present and invited by the European Commission to go to Vilnius, where they had ICT 2013. And that was amazing, where you had over 5,000 people, more than 200 exhibits where people could go around building up their friendships and the networks. So presumably that was really part of preparing for Horizon 2020, so that people could be able to put their kind of platforms together. So congratulations there to the Commission for having been able to be forward-thinking and helping people prepare for what is going to be, I think, a very big deal, Horizon 2020, for many people in this room and lots of people outside waiting to participate in the programs.
Thank you very much, and thank you to James, to Garza, and to Christian, who is now off to another meeting. Thank you very much. Now, what we are going to do next is part 2 of the program. And that must begin, I think, with a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm only just here because a plane that I was supposed to be on from Florence, where I was speaking at the European Institute there, was cancelled. But I'm here. And one learns in this job to be able to control one's blood pressure at airports. One doesn't learn much else, but one does learn that. And I'm very pleased that I'm here. This afternoon, the discussions on the multi-annual financial framework and the budget for 2014 creaked forward, lurched forward a further notch, and it's possible, I'd say probable, that Parliament in its plenary in Strasbourg next week is going to be able to vote on the entire package, the financial package that will direct our spending for the next medium-term period. It's been an extraordinarily tricky negotiation, as you all appreciate, in troubling circumstances for national budgets and for European budgets. Growth in public expenditure has been an extremely unpopular theme, despite the fact that spending on things at the European level can produce great cost efficiencies, economies of scale, and assist to oil the market in places where there is market failure. But as a parliament, we always have to insist on the added value of spending at the European level, and we haven't always been able to get that argument quite right. So there have been things in the settlement that will disappoint an awful lot of people. But an area where the message has got home is that science spending at the European level is a good thing and increasingly important and increasingly central to making the case for Europe and for science. I think that science is an integrator. It's a factor of integration because it networks scholars and institutes at a very high level. And I hope it can be proved that the European science project has been greatly promoted, is sustained and promoted by prudent spending at the European level. And of course, science is also a great innovator, an integrator and an innovator. And if we are to be serious about being competitive, we all know we have to innovate. And one of the greatest exponents of successful innovation is our speaker this evening. You probably can't recall this, but I was employed by the Acorn company in Cambridge, and I think about 1975 or 6, to advise you about the Esprit program. The Esprit program was the first of the European technology programs. It was at the time controversial. The spending actually wasn't very large, but it was very good. And it actually paved the way for all that has happened since. I spun off into other fields, political science and law, and then I fell through the trap to politics. But Cambridge has always been my own home, and I've been very proud to represent it here for the last 14 years. And I also represent the east of England, which is much larger than Cambridge. But if you try to explain what the region is here, nobody knows. So Cambridge is the shorthand for the place that I represent. And of course, it is the Cambridge phenomenon that we're here to discuss this evening and to draw lessons, if we can, about the growth of a cluster for European science. So, Herman, it's a great pleasure that you're here, and we look forward with great interest to all you have to say. And then after that, there'll be a panel discussion in which you can query him politely.
Well, thank you very much for your kind words of introduction. I was delighted to hear this emphasis on innovation, and it's not before time that innovation has now achieved the central political position in the political discourse about the future of Europe. I was indeed very familiar with Esprit. In fact, I served for 10 years on the Esprit Advisory Board. And as you rightly pointed out, it was quite a modest undertaking at the time, because we noticed that the total amount that we spent on R&D in Europe during the Esprit times, which was the forerunner of the framework program, was equivalent to our spending on tomato subsidies. As you know, things haven't changed all that much because of the completely disproportionate balance between agriculture and innovation. I mean, if there ever was a political scandal in terms of looking backwards rather than forwards, it is that balance between the amount of money that Europe is willing to spend on agriculture, which, as we heard, employs 1.6% of the population, and innovation, which, given that unemployment is probably our number one problem in Europe, and innovation is the way out of this unemployment situation, because, as we know, small companies create jobs, big companies create wealth. But if you look at big companies do not create jobs at the same rate that small companies. So what I want to talk to you about tonight really is all to do with innovation. I have spent a lifetime helping companies and projects out of universities into successful companies. I'm probably one of two people in the UK and probably a handful of Europeans that have funded more than 100 companies. So I'm no smarter than other people, I just have a lot more data. And what does the data say? Well, the data says lots of things that I think are generally accepted now. If you want to do innovation, you cannot hope to do innovation across Europe equally. Like in America, like anywhere else, innovation sort of centers around clusters. Normally clusters that have specific expertise, world-class universities or leading companies in particular fields. And it's also very important that innovation in these clusters is supported in particular sectors. There is no silver bullet to create lots of innovative high-tech companies. There is a different mechanism that works in each of the different fields. So we heard earlier about Rolls-Royce doing work all over the world in research. Rolls-Royce has an excellent track record of working closely with many universities. But the way Rolls-Royce works is not a template that works for pharma or works for energy or works for the semiconductor industry or indeed the internet. All these different sectors need different expertise and different ways of getting innovation to the market. And there is a group of financiers in Europe called venture capitalists who specialize in these different sectors, and they've actually had quite a hard time since 2008. And I do run a venture capital firm as well after being a serial entrepreneur for many years, a company called Amadeus Capital Partners. And there were about 400 venture capital companies in the year 2000 that invested, and arguably that was too many, and there was too much excitement about the internet and all the high technology companies. But now we're down to 40 that have money to invest, and this is clearly too little. So as always, these pendulums swing one way and then the other. And at the moment, it's actually a very good time to invest in high technology companies and innovation. Why? Europe has always had a spectacular strength in our universities, in our expertise. We do not have a problem with technology. We do create enough research and scientific papers, and in fact we are comparable to the US in that. Interestingly, we also start enough companies. There is a myth that America starts many more companies than Europe. This is not true. We do start enough companies. The problem is we don't grow them fast enough. And it's that growth that is facilitated by venture capital, and there is so much less venture capital in Europe than there is in the States, that this has become a real problem. Hence my earlier question about the 2.7 billion that have been earmarked for financial support for innovation in Europe. And for some reason, and I don't know why, at the moment all of that is dedicated to debt, which is useless to innovation, because companies that really innovate normally have no assets, so they cannot access the debt market. The only money that they can access is equity money. And the right way of putting equity to work in an innovation context is through funds of funds. There is a perfectly good market mechanism to deploy this money into innovation, and that is give the money to fund of funds who then select the successful teams, venture capital teams in different sectors in Europe. And say if there was $500 million or $1 billion spent on that, if that goes into fund of funds, there would be a multiplier, because you probably only need to give 25% of a fund of funds that is supported by Europe, and the other 75% would then come from the market. So there would be probably a 3 or 4 to 1 leverage of any commission money that would be put into innovation. So in my opinion, this is the single most important thing that still needs to be decided on Horizon 2020, to make sure that the 2.7 million that have been earmarked for financial support for innovation is that a substantial part of that is put aside for equity. So let me tell you about two specific themes tonight. One is the work that I've done for the British government over many years on studying the problem of universities and industry and translation. And then I'll give you two examples of how Cambridge, where I live, has become a high technology cluster, and I'll give you two examples of companies, ARM and Solexa, that have succeeded. Of course, out of the 100 investments that I've made, there are many, many investments that I've failed that I will not tell you about today, but if you catch me afterwards, I'm very happy to own up to it. But I can tell you one particular data point, which I'm very keen for you to note. Out of the 100 investments that I've made in technology, there is one single investment that failed because the technology didn't work. Just 1 out of 100. Companies fail lots of different ways. The market isn't ready, the team breaks up, there isn't enough money for it, but there is only one single example that I have where, sadly, this researcher comes to a board meeting and tells us the project that we had where we thought we could produce a completely new optical disc. He has worked out the equation to show that this cannot be done. So we had to close down the company. But this is the one example. So about the works that I've done for government over many years. Well, the first government committee I sat on was during Esprit times called the Albi Committee. When we looked at science in Europe and science in Britain in particular, and reports came in that $500 million will be spent in Korea on the semiconductor industry. The Koreans did not have a semiconductor industry. And I remember the UK government explicitly saying, this is crazy. These guys are throwing all this money on semiconductors. Why would you want to do semiconductors? And Britain had two of the leading semiconductor companies in the world at the time, Ferranti, that invented field programmable gate arrays, which are one of the main chips that are being sold in the world, and Plessy invented one of the best CMOS semiconductor processes, which also turned out to be very important. And Britain just did not provide the support for its semiconductor industry that Korea did. And those of you who know Korea, of course, know that this is now a multi-tens of billion sector that Korea dominates with Samsung, LG, Hynix, and the like. Then I was asked to write a report for the British government just a few years ago on technology innovation centres. So I went around the world to Korea, Taiwan, Germany with the Fraunhofer Gesellschaft, Holland with the translation, TNO translation facility that they have there, and ETRA and ITRI in Korea and Japan, respectively. And it is just very important for each European country to have an institution that can take innovation out of universities, also innovation that might take a long time to develop. So these technology innovation centres, which are now called catapults in the UK, have a time frame that's longer than 10 years. Things that are much shorter than 10 years can be funded by venture capital funds, but all venture capital funds have a 10-year time horizon. So if there are projects, in particular in energy or in materials, that always take longer than 10 years, there are really only two sources of funding we can have for them, and that's either the government or very large companies that take a long-term view. So my proposal, which has been adopted by the British government, and there are £200 million now being spent on them, but I understand that the government is willing to spend a lot more over the next few years, is to set up 7 of these catapult centres, and these are the criteria that I put forward which were accepted. The first criterion is that we've got to have world-leading research and world-leading technology for a catapult to be set up, so that it's not a matter of filling in holes, it's a matter of building on mountains, because if we don't have a world-leading position, we have no chance of competing on a global scale, and this has become very much a global game. The second criterion was that the technology that we're going to support that way had to have buy-in from industry. So the funding model is, in fact, the same as with the Fraunhofer Gesellschaft, that a third of the money has to come from industry, a third comes from the government, and then the last third comes from project finance, which could also include framework program funding. And the last criterion was that Britain or any other country ought to have the absorptive capacity, that when finally we produce some interesting results that could benefit Europe to exploit some new technology, there is the infrastructure and there is the capability of the country to take advantage of this. So this has been quite a successful project. As I said, there are 7 of these catapult centers in a number of different areas, like stem cell technology, offshore wind technology, automotive technology. I don't know how many of you know that Britain actually now produces more cars than it ever has, and has become a net exporter of cars, very much to my surprise. And this is because there are some very good infrastructure in the Midlands. At present, I'm chairing a committee of the Royal Society. The Royal Society is our oldest scientific society, which was founded in 1660. And when you get elected to the Royal Society, as I have had the pleasure of being, I think I'm the first venture capitalist that has ever become an FRS of the Royal Society. You sign this book, and they're all sort of very hush about this book, and you wear the special glove to sign the thing in the book. And they say, what's so special about this book? Well, it's rather old, they say. So it stems from the 17th century. Well, who else has signed the book? Well, Newton and Einstein and all these famous people. So the Royal Society is our top scientific society, and the Royal Society has always had really quite a close relationship with industry and always been very applied. The Royal Society produced these big challenges in the 18th and 19th century, like the Harris clock. There was this big problem of finding out where you are when you're at sea with a ship. And for that, you could look at the sun and find out the latitude, but in order to find out the longitude, you had to have a very accurate clock. And there was a guy called Harris who fixed that with the Harris clock. But that was a Royal Society-sponsored project, as opposed to the equivalent to a catapult in the 18th century. What my committee is looking at is the relationship between science, industry, and the translation of science into industry. And the Royal Society is trying to move closer to industry now, that it's clear that this has become a race. This has become a race between nations, that when there is a new scientific breakthrough, when there is a new invention, a new idea that appears, it normally appears in a number of different areas in the world. And the race is between those nations that have managed to organize their affairs such so that they can translate these breakthroughs quickly into companies and exploit these breakthroughs for their economies, and those that are falling behind. And I think we have no option but to participate in this race and organize our affairs so that we do this efficiently. There are people always, of course, ask, and governments always ask, what can be done here? Well, there are a number. I sat on the Williams Committee that made 3 recommendations, all of which were taken up by the British government, and all of which had a profound effect on innovation in Britain. One was R&D tax credits. So if you spend a lot on R&D as a British company, all the amount of money that you spend on R&D, you actually get back from tax that you have paid in cash. And many, in fact, if not all of my portfolio companies at Amadeus live for another quarter on these tax credits. They've been incredibly beneficial. The second change in the law in Britain was the equivalent of the American prudent man legislation. And this is slightly counterintuitive. And the American prudent man legislation argument goes as follows. If you are a prudent man advising a pension fund, which is, of course, a very conservative investment fund, then a prudent man will take a small portion of, a very large fund and put it in quite risky investments, because very risky investments give you a much higher return. Now, of course, often they fail, but when they work, they give the higher return. So this was the prudent man legislation in the US. Pension funds in the UK were not allowed to invest in risky investments at the time. They now can, and some of them still do invest in venture capital, but not enough. There isn't enough money in European venture capital. And the third thing was a change in the way options are taxed. There was a very substantial decrease in tax from about, I think at that time, 60% to just 10% for options in high technology companies. So let me now go on to universities. And the point was made earlier that it is actually quite important to have universities at a global standard. Now, Britain is, of course, doing extremely well. We have 4 universities, Cambridge normally at the top, Oxford, Imperial, and UCL in the top 10 in the world. Sadly, this is not the case elsewhere in Europe. The university system in the rest of Europe really doesn't have, we don't have many universities apart from these British universities in the top 20 or even the top 100. So this is something that we have to clearly improve on. Now let me come on to Cambridge. People often say, well, these little companies, these technology companies, what impact do they have? Well, if you aggregate all the Cambridge companies, of which there are some 1,500 high technology companies, we actually employ now over 57,000 people. So it is, a significant employer in the east of England, and we have revenues of £13 billion in aggregate. And this, when I say these 1,500 companies, £13 billion and 57,000 people employed, people often forget the numbers, of course. So I've found a new way of telling you that this is important, and that is I've tried to find a company that all of you know, which is smaller than our aggregate of all our high-tech companies in Cambridge, and the answer is Rolls-Royce. Rolls-Royce has revenues of £12 billion. We have revenues of £13 billion. Rolls-Royce employs 43,000 people. We employ 47,000 people. Rolls-Royce is a fantastically successful company, growing well in Britain, but we grow faster. Rolls-Royce exports a lot and is, commended by the British government for the fantastic exports that we have with Rolls-Royce, but Cambridge exports more. So, you've got to see it in next context, because if a government feels if Rolls-Royce needs some support, or, BMW or any of our great European companies, there is no problem with the politicians giving support to these important companies. But if it comes to high tech, that support doesn't seem to be forthcoming in the same extent. Let me just tell you then 2 specific cases of 2 companies that I've been involved in. In 1995, I was asked by the Financial Times to predict when Cambridge would have the first billion-dollar company by market cap, and I remember I crossed my fingers behind my back and predicted that in 10 years we might have one. Well, we actually have had 11 now. Only 5 had anything to do with me. But one, called ARM, has become our most successful company. It's not a very well-known company, but let me tell you that all of you actually wear our products right now, unless you don't have a mobile phone. Because ARM has practically 100% market share. We say more than 95%, but actually it's probably more than 99% of the microprocessors in mobile phones. It's a company that's worth $25 billion. We have sold, we will sell over 10 billion ARM microprocessors this year. This is more processors than there are people on Earth. And the reason for that is that, say, the iPhone, if you pick a well-known phone, has 5 ARMs in them. So there's the iPad or the Samsung or the HTC or the Sony or Nokia. And the number is so high that in this 1 year, we're selling more microprocessors than Intel has sold in its entire history as a company. So people say, but these are very cheap chips. Well, let me surprise you with another interesting statistic. Since 2010, the value of the ARM chips that are being sold worldwide by our licensees — ARM is a license company. We don't actually sell the processor itself. We sell licenses to companies that then sell the processors. So if you add up the value of all the ARM processors being sold worldwide by Qualcomm, Sony, Toshiba, Intel as well, interestingly, then the total dollar value of these ARM chips has also overtaken Intel sales. That's $40 billion a year. So it's a very little-known company because it only has 330 customers. And these are the 330 licensees, the 330 semiconductor companies in the world that produce ARM chips. The second company I want to tell you about in a little more detail because it is a good example of how European innovation has contributed to another breakthrough, and this time in gene sequencing. There are 2 professors of chemistry, Shankar Balasubramanian and David Klinneman, who invented sequencing by synthesis. And this completely revolutionized gene sequencing. It cost about $10 million to produce the human genome at that time on existing machines, which were ABI machines, the 3700. And we reduced the cost from $10 million to $1,000. $10 million to $1,000. So this is a factor of 10,000 in 5 years. I've lived off Moore's law all my life, which is a factor of 2 every 2 years, or you've got 5 doublings in a decade. It's a factor of 32 a decade, which was a factor of 10,000 in 5 years. And we haven't stopped here yet either. I think we will drive this down to below $100 in a few years' time, when I'm sure every newborn baby will be gene sequenced in the same way that we do blood groups of newborn babies, so we know if they need a transfusion, what blood transfusion we give to the baby. We will be able to do everybody's genome so that they know which drugs will be appropriate for them when they fall ill. So it's a very, very important development. But let me tell you the way we spun this thing out of Cambridge University. And it's a story of science, but it's also a story of management. We've always had the science in Europe. The thing that has changed over the last 20 years, and the reason why I think it makes a lot of sense to invest in European venture capital, is for 20 years we've worked very hard to improve our management capability. And if you look at Silicon Valley, during the first 20 years, American venture capital returns were not very good. And it must be said, European venture capital returns aren't very good. But after that 20-year period, when there was the knowledge, when there was the entrepreneurs, when there was the management that was educated during those 20 years, often through lots of failures. Now, we've had these 20 years, and my belief is that we'll create great companies over the next 10 years supported by venture capital. So this team, which we spun out from Cambridge University, produced a machine that increased the throughput by a factor of 100. And then, because of the venture capital companies that we had with our international networks, we went to the US and saw somebody called John West. John West was in charge of $1 billion division of ABI, who at that time had an 80% market share of gene sequencing machines. And we said, we have bad news and we have good news. The bad news is that we have a machine that we've developed in Cambridge which is 100 times better than the machine that you are selling at the moment, and we're going to blow you out of the water. The good news is we want you to do it. And he, being an MIT graduate, was willing to come to Cambridge, look at the technology, realized that it was a revolutionary technology that will change the way gene sequencing is being done, and he was willing to join us as a CEO. And that's quite a significant event. If you look at small European high technology companies to attract international management talent, in this case from Silicon Valley, but from anywhere else in the world, and is a very important part of the puzzle. So he arrived in Cambridge, and those of you who know our scientists, and they're typical for European scientists, he arrived and he said, we will deliver a 1G machine in 12 months' time, 1G being a billion base pairs per experiment. And a number of people in the company left in disgust and said, this is a total idiot. There's absolutely no way we can deliver a 1G machine in 12 months' time. And some of them actually left the company because they thought this was such an idiotic idea. And the answer was they were both right. The company did deliver a 1G machine in 12 months' time, and it didn't work. So that's where the expertise of an outstanding CEO comes to bear. Because John West knew there was a market for machines that didn't work, because he'd been selling them for all. So why? Why was there a market for machines that didn't quite work? They did not work. They just didn't work as well as they should have. And the answer was that because of this revolution, that things got 100 times better. I mean, when have we last heard something getting 100 times better? All the big gene sequencing centers were in competition to do more genomes and do bigger patient cohorts on cancer and so on. So the advantage that they would get from this new machine was phenomenal. Now, he knew them all. He knew they were in a competition, and he went to them and said, there are 8 of you. I'm a little Cambridge company. I can only work with 3 of you. But the 3 of you who are willing to pay a full price for a machine that doesn't quite work yet, and if you are willing to work with me over the next year, we can make this machine really work, then you will be the first one to have this machine and can deploy it. All 8 of them wanted to do that. Only 3 of them were chosen. And one of them was the Broad Institute had a particular condition. He said, I will not order 1 machine. I will order 15 machines from you under one condition. You don't tell anybody else that I did that. And indeed, they then became the main gene sequencing center in the world. These are 2 success stories in Europe based on university research. Maybe before I finish, I ought to just tell you the story about ARM, because when I started the ARM processor, I gave 2 advantages to that design team. One was I gave them no people, so it's the only microprocessor in the world that was produced by just 2 people. And the second advantage I gave them was no money. So they had to keep that processor really, really, really small and simple. And the side effect, which wasn't one of the original design aims, was that it consumed very little power. And because it consumed so little power, but had high performance, it was ideal for mobile phones. And Nokia came to see us and said, they wanted that processor, and said, what do you want, a PC processor and a mobile phone? It's a complete waste of time. So you wouldn't know what to do with that much. He said, yes, we do. We want all these new features on phones. And when Nokia adopted it, all the other companies then adopted it as well. So let me just conclude saying that innovation, in my opinion, is the single most important subject for support in Europe. And the only way to do this is do it very selectively, do it in areas where there is a cluster of expertise, where we're world-class, and where we can build world-class companies. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you greatly for that. I think I suspect you've only, as it were, scraped the surface of your great experience in Cambridge and around the globe in this extraordinary career that you've had. But it's very, very interesting, and it provokes an awful lot of thoughts, and I hope questions for us all, certainly as policy makers at the European level. There are serious lessons to draw from your experience, which has been very rich and fruitful for us. Richard is looking nervous.
No, I was just going to, first of all, introduce Waldemar Kut, the Deputy Chef de Cabinet for Commissioner Geoghegan-Quinn. I was going to ask him before we leave to, as I said, say what's next with Horizon 2020, to bring it back down to the Brussels scene. But I have one immediate question for Herman, if I may. We first met in the mid-'80s when you were having one of your less successful ventures, or what proved to be. So, all right, what went wrong there? Is there a lesson from Acorn Computer that is relevant to policymakers? And for those of you who don't know the company, Acorn was, I think it was the largest, for a while, the largest competitor to Apple.
Well, Apple wasn't really competition in the UK because we had a 60% market share, and our computer was so much better than the Apple, of course. The problem was one of scale at the time. So arguably, I remember Bill Gates visiting me. We were the first company that grew from 0 to £100 million in revenue in just 5 years in Britain. It was a fantastic story of growth, but also a fantastic story, or a very sad story, of great difficulties after the 5 years. Acorn then was a medium-sized company for another 10 years. And in fact, the BBC microarchitecture together with the VAX 780 were the two longest-lived computer architectures ever in the world. And they educated British school kids on computing. But the difficulty was that the management expertise that I would argue we now have, we didn't have at the time. And I'm a physicist. I did my PhD in physics. I didn't know anything about stock control. We never had any stock. Anything that we bought shipped straight out. And when finally people didn't buy so many, we didn't have a warehouse. We got into serious financial difficulties. The other problem we had is we were very successful in the UK, but it was a global game. So we really had to be successful in the US and elsewhere, and that was something that we just didn't know how to do.
And is there a lesson for government for this? Yes, Waldemar.
I would want to ask the same question. You said there's one thing we lack in Europe, and that's growing companies. And you kind of hinted at that it's an issue of venture capital that's maybe not there, or sufficient equity. My question would have been to you is, what about European single market as a factor, or the missing European single market as a factor of that non-growth? I've looked at biotech companies in the early 2000s, and you're right, we had 2 times as much entrepreneurs. The number of biotech companies, I think in 2003, was twice as the one in the US. The venture capital was there, but it was for the smaller investments. You didn't get the investment into doing the clinical trials and all this. What the point that a lot of people made at that time was, actually, if you invest 50 million to do a clinical trial and to go for the drug, you don't do it in Europe, you do it in the US, because the US market at that time was twice as much. Spending in the US is 15% of GDP on health. In Europe, it's 9%. Spending on drugs is twice as much. You have 27 at that time, less. Different markets, different selections. So for a young company to grow into an Amgen was considered by the biotech scene at that time almost impossible in Europe. So I would like to say, when you're also looking at the semiconductor and all this, I even hear sometimes the issue that why did Nokia fail? It didn't go to the US. I mean, so I would like to hear your point, because that's very important for policy. We can put a lot of money into research, into venture capital and all this, but if there's a fundamental issue which is beyond that, we also have to work on that. I think that's important.
I think that's a very important point that you make, but let me sort of, and everything that you've said I totally agree with. I mean, you've just characterized extremely well. Obviously, you've had experience of that. But let me just put a slightly more positive spin on that, and that is contrasting where we are now to where we were 20 years ago. So the main changes that have happened, more so in ICT than in pharma, but it's happening in pharma as well, is that this really is becoming a global market. And the big advantage that American companies used to have, which they still do have in pharma, but no longer in ICT, was that being successful in America was good enough. Because everybody then said, well, they're so successful, we want to buy their stuff anyway. And it was almost a suck of the products out of America into the rest of the world. This is not the case anymore. These are global markets, and people often don't care where the product is coming from anymore. They care about the specification. So as long as we can produce a product that is suitable for the global market, they will buy it from us. They won't even know whether it was made in Germany, made in the UK, made in Portugal, or made in Estonia. If as Skype has, Skype is the worldwide success, and yet it was produced in Estonia. On the healthcare market in particular, we have a number of fantastic national assets, like the National Health Service in Britain, like many of the health services in Europe, where drug trials should be cheaper and it should be easier to do it. But partially because of regulatory issues, we do not provide the infrastructure that allows you to take advantage of the structure that the organizations that we have to do drug trials inexpensively. The great opportunity that I think that we have, especially with big data, is if we could get our regulatory scheme organized in such a way that we can get access at the health records for these trials, I think we could be a world-winning Europe.
Questions? Yes, back there. Please identify yourself.
My name is John Wiles. First of all, thank you, Mr. Hauser, for an extraordinarily interesting talk. And I was particularly interested in your remarks about debt and how senseless it was for Europe to put more than 2 billion, or make more than 2 billion available, as it were, in debt. In my experience of European public spending, there is no precedent for investment in equity by the provision of equity. And my question is, which governments in Europe actually do that? In other words, which governments invest in high-tech startups?
Well, what we do have is we have the European Investment Fund. The slightly sad thing that has happened is...
Please turn off the microphone there.
The sad thing that has happened is they have become so dominant. There are now, I think, 60% of the money that goes into venture capital, that there is no diversity, there is no competition. So the ideal thing for this money that's set aside, the 2.7 million that's set aside, is that even if just a billion or even less than a billion was being put into the market of funder funds, not into venture capital, but funder funds that then select the venture capital companies, then there is a much more even playing field where you don't have a 60% gorilla making all the decisions on what European venture capital ought to do, but there is more market diversity, which I think would help fund these young venture capital teams as well.
Question?
Yes, I could just comment on that issue. I think that the present problem that bonds are more attractive than equity is obviously something to do with the financial crisis, which has been more protracted and profound than anyone expected or indeed had wished for. I imagine that as the clouds lift, the European equity market is to become a lot more attractive again, as it used to be in those early years. I've got a...
No, but I just to point out that of course this 2.7 billion is for both. I mean, we're doing both what we call the risk sharing finance facility, where actually the money that we're investing here is it's guaranteeing basically investments from the EIB. So the actual loans that we can give out are almost a factor of 10. Because we have a guarantee, the other part of the guarantee comes from the EIB, and that guarantees the loans. And then you can add on top of that actually the additional private investment. So the leverage factor of that money is very high. What we do, as in the CIP, the previous CIP, and also what we're doing now, is that we have also funds of funds investment. But of course, that also is in the current situation. I mean, we can have funds of funds which is 10, 25% maximum, depending on the sector and all this. But the 75% have to come somewhere else. And that is more of a problem, let's say, than actually our part of the investment. Yes.
A question, coming back to the people who actually do inventions.
Identify yourself.
Anna Frostegård from Karolinska Institute of Sweden. And I see now a young generation who come to me and they basically are quite skeptical about making innovations. They're quite skeptical in a way how the innovation will be taken by the darker side, business side, developing it further. And I have difficulties actually motivating people to understand that innovation is so important. It doesn't matter that there's no incentive in the academic career nowadays, at least not in Sweden, to be innovative. And I think this is also something which I'm missing in the conversation. What would you say to the young scientists who say, I don't want to be an innovator?
Well, you touch a most important subject here, which is the cultural attitudes to innovation. When I first started doing high technology businesses at Cambridge University, and I suggested to some of our top professors to spin out companies, the reaction I got is, how dare you suggest that I dirty my pure academic hands and do this pact with mammon? I'm pleased to report that this has all but disappeared. So there has been, over the 20 years, 30 years now that I've been doing this, there's been this big cultural shift. But this cultural shift also needs a policy push. So there has been a lot of encouragement in Britain for universities to write impact reports, for example. So whenever they apply for any research grants, they have to write a paragraph on the impact that this research might have on industry. And this has changed people's attitude to the way they think about research. And I am just now delighted to see young people in Cambridge, researchers, talking about the companies that they might start and they are excited about. And, cultural changes take a long time.
Can I add that a problem that you spoke of and then politely cruised past is the sclerotic state of an awful lot of our universities on the, as we would describe it, on the mainland. and I speak to professors who are at their wits' end in German universities, who ought to be at the cutting edge of science because of the constraints, the restrictions, the bureaucracy, the hand of the state upon education at that level. I think that we need a liberation of universities. I think this has been quite correctly picked up by President Barroso, and we must pass it on to his successors in the next Commission.
Waldemar, Andrew, if we may change the gear, I'm mindful of the time and the clock here. So, Waldemar, what's next?
What's next? Well, next is the vote in Parliament, as we are here, and we hope all is going to go okay next week. And then we would be ready to go and publish our work programs on the 11th December. That's what we're heading at.
On the 11th of December.
11th of December.
Okay, so what are the work programs? What does this mean? When do
Well,
you apply? All that stuff.
Well, the work program is basically contains the call for proposals, the contents of the calls for proposals for the next 1 or 2 years or the first 2 years of the Horizon 2020. So this is usually all of the 3 pillars that we have, whether it's the ERC calls, infrastructures, Marie Curie fellowships, whether it's the topics within the societal challenges areas, whether the topics for the key enabling technologies areas. All these first calls, I think it's worth about, depending on whether you take constant or current prices, it's around 10 million euros per year. So we're basically having the level of investment that we had in 2013. We're keeping up now for the next 7 years. So all these calls, all these details will be out on the 11th of December.